Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Testers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. This is instead just an open conversation. I'm here, I'm chilling. I'll be talking about whatever I'm talking about. I'm doing my best to make my guesses about who you are watching this either live with me now or watching this later on YouTube or wherever. I'm doing my best to make guesses about who you are and what you're interested in, what you are interpreting off of what I'm saying, how I'm impacting you. For those of you who are willing and able to participate in the chat, I appreciate that because it gives me more information on which to base those guesses about who you are, what you're interested in, how I'm impacting you, and so on. One of the many ways in which this is not therapy is that it was a live stream broadcast on the internet. As you know, if you're here watching this, anyone can come and watch this. It says in private. So keep that in mind when you're putting things in the chat. Your comments will show up under the username of the account that you're watching this through. So if you're watching this on Facebook, it'll be associated with your Facebook account you're logged into. YouTube, it'll be your YouTube account, and Twitch, your Twitch account. I will also do my best to read out the comments that come in because each of you will only see the comments that appear on the platform you're on. So to keep us all on the same page, I try to read out the comments that come in so everybody hears and knows what we're talking about. Until and unless we have comments come in, I'm just going to be talking about whatever is on my mind so that it's not just dead air. Say something. I work with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, family, and group therapy with people in the states of Illinois and Wisconsin. We also work with a few coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. All of our coaches are trained here at Effective Artistry to do executive functioning coaching work. Each of them also has additional specialties and experience with other types of coaching, creativity and artistry coaching, parenting coaching, business and professional coaching. I feel like I missed something for sure this time. Anybody here to reference and let me know. I apologize if the sound is off. I am boiling some tea water at the moment. Just checking to make sure I've got the correct number. Sometimes that causes an issue with filtering out the sound, but that'll be done in a moment. I like to have my tea while we chat. Let me take a second here because I do think I forgot. Maybe not. Oh, if you are willing and able to chat in the comments, please don't worry about whether or not what you're saying is like a response to what I'm talking about, topic or anything like that. That's not how conversations work in real life. That's not how they're meant to work. It's not how we do things here. We go wherever we go. Like any interaction, if one human is paying attention to another human, everything that person's doing or saying, everything that they notice impacts what that person feels and thinks and does things. So what I say impacts what you're thinking and feeling and doing. What you say impacts what I think and what I feel and what I do, and we go where we go. I think that's it. I guess I'm feeling a little less confident but I've got a lot of irons in the fire right now, personally as well as professionally. My family's in the middle of moving, not like to a new place or anything, but we were having work done on our house that was extensive enough that we had to be living elsewhere while it was being done. And it's not quite done yet, but it's done enough that we are in the process of moving back into our house. So there's a lot going on in that regard, both in the moving and in the finishing up the work there. And then also here at work at Effective Artistry, we've got a lot of things going on, a lot of work being done with clients that, it's great. Also some things on the logistical side and on the structural side. So we have a lot going on, and I guess I am operating in this mode of having my eye on many different things at the same time. I'm off camera here for a second while I pour some tea. Which, like, now that I'm talking about that, as often happens, that's what I'm thinking about. But before I started talking, I was thinking about a different thing to talk about for today, or at least as I pointed out to start off with for today. And now that's what I'm thinking about, and I forgot what I was thinking about just a moment ago. This is something that's been coming up in my work a lot lately, personal life too. But just in my attempts to communicate with people and be supportive and helpful to people, this has been coming up a lot lately, where there is oftentimes this idea, whether somebody consciously believes, oh, this is a hair tie that I've got around my hand, just in case anybody is curious. I'm just fidgeting with it like that. There's oftentimes an idea that in order for like a person's feelings to be considered to be valid and important, that those feelings also then must be like a 100% accurate reflection of reality, or an accurate evaluation of what is the most reasonable or best response to have to what's going on, which is unfortunate, because while that's often the case, right, like something scary happens and we are then scared because of the scary thing, and the extent to which we are feeling scared is directly proportionate to the thing that's happening. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes what happens is not warranting, it's not deserving of being that scared, right? It still makes sense that a person feels very scared in response to it. That's a big part of the point of like therapy or analysis, psychoanalysis of any kind, is that we're looking at people have their own individual reasons, whether it's about experiences in the past or the way that they're perceiving or interpreting things. But there's always reason for an individual to respond the way that they do, right? That, like, let's say that I've experienced trauma in the past, and loud noises were somehow involved, right? And then now whenever a siren passes by outside, it makes me panic. It spikes my alarm, right? Then we could all say that, like, that's an understandable response for me to have. It's a reasonable response for me to have. We can also say, though, that that is not an entirely proportionate response to the reality of what's happening in the situation, right? That the reason I'm afraid has to do with my prior experiences or the way that I've been shaped or the way I'm perceiving things, not just because of what's going on. It's important to be able to hold space for both things, because otherwise we get stuck flip-flopping back and forth between, on the one hand, it's like, okay, the way that I or somebody else feels is totally valid and important and should be like taken into consideration, and therefore their opinion on the matter or their ideas of what should happen next must be correct. Or we flip between that and then the other thing of like, well, that person's ideas or opinion are not correct, and therefore their feelings should not matter or are not valid and should not be taken into consideration. Or their ideas of what to do are great and therefore they're great, or their ideas of what to do are bad and therefore they're bad, dumb, or whatever, they're wrong. This makes sense that we think about things like this oftentimes, but we have to know that it's possible for two things to be true there in the middle, where like a person's feelings can be important and valid, that they can matter and should be taken into consideration, and they can be wrong about their interpretation of a situation or their ideas about what to do. If we can't allow space for that, like, I was going to call it a contradiction, but honestly, I don't think it's a contradiction. My hand, by the way, also has a bunch of like little injuries on it. I've been doing work trying to move us back in the house and hammered my finger and various different things. If we can't hold space for that, then when those situations arise where someone's feelings, including our own, are important and valid, and also our idea of what's happening or what to do about it is a bad one or a wrong one, or suboptimal, inappropriate, whatever word. When that happens, that's when we end up flipping back and forth of like, no, my feelings matter. I'm a smart person. What I think is happening and what I think should be done should be respected, and it's good. But because we also, in this scenario we're talking about, because our ideas are not actually optimal, then sometimes we flip over to like, okay, I'm wrong about this, and I'm overreacting, and I'm an idiot and a monster, and nobody should ever listen to me. And that's ridiculous too. So then we flip back sometimes over to like, no, the way I feel matters and it's important. And like such and such happened and so did this. And like that is reasonable. It's worth being mad about. And we end up going back and forth. So we want to be able to hold space for both like emotionality and rationality. Both of these things matter. They're both important. Neither should be used in isolation from the other. We can use them together, right? Specifically, something that's been coming up a lot recently is when someone is in a situation where like even the best options are still bad ones, right? That like I'm in a position where no matter what I do, stuff is going to happen that I don't like. That, and I don't mean to be. I'm not trying to suggest that that's like small or minimize that thing. I'm saying like, um, let's say I got a bad medical diagnosis, right? Where like it's potentially terminal or potentially treatable. Let's just say cancer. We're going to make a thing up. I'm not trying to reference any particular thing. It's just the thing that's coming to my mind, right? Where like the treatment is, you got to go through chemo and do all this stuff that's going to be like really rough and awful, even if it works. And if it doesn't work, there's no good option after that, right? Like after that happens, no matter what, like, yeah, that sucks. And everyone can agree that that sucks. And I'm going to be sad and angry, upset, like wishing that this wasn't happening, thinking that this is unfair. And all of that is absolutely like, I would say the most reasonable response, not the only possible response. People can respond in different ways, but most of the time people are going to be pretty upset about something like that. That doesn't mean that it's not a real thing that has to be dealt with, though. And that's where people are often struggling, or at least that I'm seeing a lot recently, is that people they're in positions where it sucks. I can agree. Everyone can agree that like, this is not fair. You shouldn't have to be in this position. Like if things had worked out, if this person had done that differently, or if the world was structured differently in that way, or if whatever, then this wouldn't be happening. And it's terrible that it is. And it is also happening. And you have to deal with it because you don't have another choice. This is a bit of a side note, but like, I think I've mentioned this, talked about this in the past, that my favorite video game I've ever played is a game called Pentiment, and it's an exploration of a lot of things, but in particular about like how humans tell stories and how we kind of build on and overwrite the past constantly, both in large ways of things like, modern cities being built on top of ancient cities, like modern Athens on top of ancient Athens or whatever. But also in terms of our own like personal life stories, not just the big ways of changing your career or making a big shift about who you are, but even in just like the little day to day of your past is something that you build off of and overwrite as you move forward. This game, it's like highly narrative. It's set in like the 16th century in what's at the time called Bavaria, I think would now be part of Germany. And it takes place over time. And one of the parts that sticks with me is talking to a character who, you met in the past, like 8 years prior, and then time has passed, and now you've met them again. And in that time, their husband has died, and one of their two children or two of their three children have died. And talking to them about like how they go on after tragedy, and their response being some version of like, because you just do, not because you like choose to or decide that it's. I'm very much paraphrasing and ad-libbing here. This is not like a direct quote from the game, but this is how it stuck with me. Is that like, it's not that you decide, you know what, I've sat down and I've looked at everything and decided that it is worth waking up today. You wake up, and then, your kid is hungry and you make them some food, and then you do whatever it is that you got to do in order to make sure that there's more food for later. And you just go and you go and you go, and a day has passed and a week has passed and years have passed, and it's not like or was a time where you sat down and decided, like, yes, this is something that I'm okay with living through or living past or moving on? It's just how it happens. You just keep going. And obviously, there are exceptions to that, although there's a lot of interesting things to discuss there, but probably not today because this is not the best. This is not the ideal medium, especially when I'm talking by myself without somebody here talking with me to address things that are very like high stakes and where people have very strong feelings and opinions. But leaving aside those exceptions, that's just what it is to be human, right? And so I think there is this thing where it's important to acknowledge that like timing matters, and what we do right now is not necessarily the same as what we're going to do later or tomorrow, right? So sometimes it happens that you get bad news or something bad happens, and all you can really do and think about in the moment, or all you feel like doing, or whatever, is just being upset about how unfair it is, about how you shouldn't have to deal with it, or being afraid of what ramifications that it has, or being sad about whatever fallout is occurring. That's often the case. Just like sometimes in the reverse, it's true, right? That something gets a lot better, and at first we relax. We finally are able to breathe, or whatever it is that just got better. We're finally able to enjoy that. We don't need to channel that into like taking action right away on either of those things. So humans, we bounce back and forth between cognition and action. We observe and contemplate things. We feel what we feel. That's all internal. And then we do stuff. And then as we're doing stuff, we observe things, and that makes it so that we think and feel more things. And then we do more stuff, and we go back and forth. So when something crappy happens to a person, it's entirely reasonable. I'm realizing I'm using that word a lot, and I kind of want to talk about what I mean by that. But it's entirely reasonable for us to then just be upset about it for a while, complain about it, vent about it, and sometimes people, our friends, or maybe even our therapists, or whoever tries to move us out of that. Well, I get it, that's really sad, but you have to do something about it. And that's great, because we do need to like move out of it sooner or later. But it's also, this is one of these finding the balance things where you want to be okay with taking the time that you take in order to kind of process, is a word everybody uses. I tend to be hesitant about that word because it just really does. It's very difficult to determine what anybody means when they say that. But yeah, we take our time. We deal with it, and sometimes we just gripe and commiserate and lament our fate for a while. And if we keep doing that forever, it's going to be a problem. If we do it for too long, it's going to be a problem, right? Theoretically, depending on the thing that's going on, there's some point at which, like, if we haven't shifted into action by this point, problems might happen. And sometimes, depending on the thing, that's right away. In fact, a lot of what we commonly in our culture refer to as traumatic events are situations like that, where something bad has happened and action needs to be taken about it, like immediately in this moment, or even more bad things will happen, and you can't like sit down and think about it and process it and feel it, right, until later. Of course, all of us are trying to prevent these things, to avoid these things, to make it so that they don't happen at all, or happen as little as we can possibly make them happen. But they do happen. So we want to respect that, taking our time, while also balancing that against the other side, that until we do something, it's not that nothing can get better without us taking action. Things can and do all the time. But until we do something, whether or not the thing gets better or worse or stays the same is entirely up to things that we're not influencing, right? Some things get better just over time. Some things get better because other people change what they're doing or whatever. And that's great. But it leaves us at the mercy of just waiting. And it comes up a lot where people will talk about, like, let's take a more mundane or benign example that's relatively common, is like, My job sucks. We'll say that. Again, every time I pick an example, because one of the rules, it's not a rule. I say that differently. There are rules about, no, that's a bad way to. Here's something that I do. Especially when I'm talking online, I try to imagine like if someone were to hear me speak, would they think that I'm talking about them? It's what I believe is best practice for therapists, because we do have rules about like you can't give identifying information about clients, right? If I were to say, even if I didn't say a person's name, if I was to say like so and so is a student in this year and at that school and whatever, like you could find out who that person is. But obviously, we're not supposed to say that. We're not allowed to say those kinds of things. But we do often talk about, like I'm doing right now, we often talk about like themes or things that come up that we notice. And sometimes people even want to use examples of, without giving identifying information. I was once talking to a client who was dealing with X or whatever. The suggestion that I've seen some others make and that I teach therapists to use is that when you're talking online, to imagine that if you are going to give like an example about a client, go beyond, am I just giving any identifying information? Go to the further step and say, if that client themselves were to watch this thing, would they be like, hey, that's me that they're talking about? Even if nobody else could identify them, could they identify themselves from it? And that's how I try to navigate these online conversations. And something that will happen that I think is kind of funny and just happened there a couple of times to me is that I won't be using an example from real life. I'm not talking about like so-and-so said such and such to me, or, I had a session or a conversation where somebody said whatever. I'm just making up an example. And then as I start to use the example, I'm like, wait a second. Someone, if they were to watch this, might think that I'm talking about them, even though I'm not talking about them. And that just happened with like 4 different examples I was trying to come up with. I'm just trying to make something up. And then as soon as I said it, I was like, oh, you know what? A bunch of people might think that I'm talking about that. Let me think if I can come up with one where I'm like, nobody's struggling. See, I'm trying to come up with an example that's like relevant to people's lives, that is a common thing that someone might be struggling with, but isn't something that anyone I personally know is struggling with. And that's tricky. Okay. Imagine that like the place you're living in floods. You live in an apartment and it floods from your upstairs neighbor. Damn it. I do know someone who's gone through that. It's been a while. I might. So I'm looking for an example of something that happens that like, now that it's happened, whatever, all of your choices are still worse than what it would be if the thing hadn't happened. All right, let's take something just so common that nobody could think I'm talking about them specifically. Let's talk about like, I've got a big project, either at work or at school, a big project that's been assigned to me, and I'm struggling with it. Whether that's I'm struggling to get myself to do it, or I'm working on it, but I don't know what to do. I don't feel like it's good, whatever. I can be in a position where I'm saying, okay, well, working on this sucks, right? It's really difficult for me. I'm being asked to do it. We'll say homework. It's really difficult for me. I'm being asked to do it like in my off hours and my free times. It's not something that I'm like doing during school or during work or whatever. And that really sucks. And I'm really busy. I've got a lot going on and it's unfair. And all these things are real. I'm not trying to, I've got a lot of things going on at home that need to be addressed, or, I have to work 2 part-time jobs in order to be able to pay my way through school. And so I got to do that. And it makes sense to me why other students would be assigned to this, because, the assumption is that they have time, but I don't have that time and it's unfair or whatever. That all sucks. And I want to talk to my friends about it. Maybe talk to my therapist, talk to whomever about like this bullshit, right? Like I have ADHD. This is a particularly difficult thing for me to do. and I've got to deal with this and this and that at this point, and I just, I can't believe that like this. I should not be having to do this. Whatever. That all makes sense to me. It does genuinely. Uh, there are all kinds of times where I personally am thinking like, yeah, this shouldn't be this way, right? And then at a certain point, and depending on the thing and the timeline, that point can come sooner or later where we have to talk about like, okay, we got to try something or we got to do something or not, but we got to accept what's going on, right? Like in this particular case, either I do the assignment, even though it's not fair for me to have to do this, even though it's difficult for me to do this, even though I haven't been taught well, whatever. I can do the assignment, and then that impacts my grade the way that it does. I cannot do the assignment, and that impacts my grade the way that it does. And we can talk about that too. Like, yeah, I wish I could just not do it, but if I don't do it, I'm going to fail the class, and that's going to be a huge problem. And like, that sucks. So now I've got two. Either I do this thing and I get the grade so that I don't fail the class, but I have to do it and I have to pay the cost of doing all that. And it's super high and I can't afford it very well. Or I don't pay the cost of doing it, but I do then accept the cost of not doing it, which is fail, and that sucks. Now, what we're always looking for is these magic extra options where like it doesn't involve anything that sucks. Is there some way to navigate this so that it is fair and not a problem and I don't have to deal with any negative consequences? And we're looking for that because sometimes that's true. Sometimes there are other solutions that we haven't thought of or we're not aware of, and somebody else can point it out to us and share it with us. So, like in the example we just talked about, we could say, well, have you talked to your professor, right? Have you explained the situation to them and see if you could get an extension, which would still be you having to do it, but it might make it easier for you to do if you have that extra time, or it wouldn't be quite as unfair or difficult, right? Or could you talk to them about finding an alternative way to be able to meet that criteria? Could you do a different type of an assessment instead of that kind of assessment if there's some reason for it? Or could you talk to them even about them there is a third option here, which is talk to the person that is in charge of the assignments and the grading and see what opportunities there might be. And there's always the possibility that there's something there. So we know that we're aware that there might be solutions that we don't know about, that we haven't thought of, that someone else might be able to propose to us. And so of course we're looking, and that's a big part of the reason that we go and talk to other people, even if we're not consciously thinking this. A big part of the reason we go and talk to other people about the problems we're dealing with, like this sucks and that's unfair and that's nonsense and that's, I know I'm saying unfair and things a lot, but it's part because I try not to swear on the stream, and the words that are coming into my mind are swear words, and then I have to replace them quickly, and I end up using the same ones over and over. We're not just venting to our friends or to other people or therapists or whomever. We're not just venting because venting feels good, although it often does. But as with everything, like we talk about, if things feel good, there's ridiculous. That's a good one. That's a comment there. Ridiculous with a question mark. And yeah, that's a good replacement word. But specifically the I replace a lot of swear words with that's ridiculous. I do also, well, I use that as a replacement word for crazy a lot of the time. Let's talk about words now. This is what we're talking about. The process of replacing a word in your vocabulary. So without getting into all the big things about vocabulary, language acquisition and how we use the words and whatever. Long story short, we end up using the words that we use. Yeah, me too. That's the comment. We end up using the words that we use, and sometimes ridiculous or silly. Yeah. Sometimes we then later on come to understand that there's some word in our language or phrase in our personal language, the way that we speak, that causes problems or is offensive or whatever, and we didn't know that. whatever the reason, something happens and we now decide that like there's a word that I do use without consciously having chosen to use it. It's just part of what comes out when I speak, that I am now consciously trying to stop using. And when we do that, a lot of the time people try to do that by just an abstinence approach where they just, it's like trying to quit smoking by just, I'm not going to smoke anymore. And that's really, really, really difficult to the extent that it like mostly just doesn't work. What we need is a replacement piece of language so that when we're trying, because that's a word or phrase that we're using because it's relevant to something we're trying, something we notice, something that we have reason to want to try to communicate to other people. So we by eliminating the word without replacing it, what we're doing then is trying to get ourselves to no longer have any reason to communicate that. And that's not going to work, right? Like there's a reason that we communicate that stuff to people. We're going to still have reasons to communicate that stuff to people. So if we don't replace the word's just going to come up sometimes. And that's what leads to a lot of like, or it's one of the things that leads to a lot of where people will just not talk about certain things with people broadly until you're like with people that you know and that you trust and that you feel like comfortable with speaking in your natural vocabulary, that they'll understand you and not judge you on it, whatever. Is that you just shift to like, okay, I only communicate these kinds of things to some people. But what we want to do is come up with a replacement word so you can communicate the same thing. Now with curse words, that's generally pretty easy to start with because curse words generally are used as like non-specific containers of meaning. There are exceptions to this, but like, for example, when you stub your toe and you curse, right? Like replacing that with any exclamation, the meaning of what you're saying is irrelevant, right? Or a lot of the time, we use curses, especially the F-bomb, in order to add emphasis, or we use them as intensifiers, right? They're like, oh, it's really cold, and then it's really effing cold is an even more intense version, right? And then we can accomplish that by sometimes literally just saying it's really, really cold or whatever. Sometimes we're using curse words to actually convey specific meaning. So this is a hard conversation to have without, like, I feel very silly because I don't curse on the stream, but now I'm referencing these words and I'm going to call them like the S word and whatever, and that feels very juvenile, but whatever. Where sometimes we use the S word to literally refer to using the bathroom, defecating, whatever. And it's relatively easy to replace those there because any curse words in our language that have meaning like that do have very common other words that mean the same thing by the nature of the fact that like we try, broadly speaking, culturally, like what a curse word is something that we culturally identify as being taboo. Actually, it's not really taboo, obviously, but we use it as a signifier of somebody breaking decorum. So there must be the polite versions of those words. In this case, talking about this today, the word that I keep thinking and then not saying is BS. It's BS. And having a hard time replacing it because ridiculous is something that I would use sometimes, but the particular meaning that I'm trying to convey with it, or the reason it's coming up in this conversation, is the idea that it's BS that I would be put in this position. It's BS that someone is doing that or that things are structured, So that's why I keep saying unfair as the replacement to convey that this, like, I'm upset at the person or the structure or whatever it is in place that has put me in this position, and it shouldn't have been done that way. Unfair is the one that I keep coming up with for that. I'll say that, so a while back, this has been several years now, and I also want to be clear too that there's no, like, I have 3 kids. They're currently 9, 6, and 4. And they all know curse words. I curse relatively frequently, and so does my wife. I mean, certainly we don't do it to the same frequency, like when we're with our children or when we're in public or whatever. But my philosophy on all this is just words are words. And what you want to know is Yes, BS does convey more moral outrage. Yeah, it's a good phrase for it, moral outrage. Um, and of course, sometimes, right? Like other times, BS does, ridiculous replaces it just fine. Um, but language is entirely like communication is about the impact we're attempting to have on the other person. Using language in a different way, which sometimes we do, like I sing songs by myself or whatever. I'm not communicating when I'm doing that. In communication, we're saying things or doing things with the intent to impact how somebody else is going to like what they interpret or how they think or feel or what they do next or whatever. It's not about manipulation. It's the nature of communication. It is by definition an attempt to change something in your awareness. By communicating something to you, I'm making you aware of something, right? Changing what you're thinking. Meaning you're thinking about whatever I just said when beforehand you were not, at least in theory. So what I teach my kids and what I believe is that when you acquire a language, what you want to know is that these are tools, right? And you want to know how to use those tools. And curse words are words that many people are going to be bothered by, especially many people based on the circumstances might be bothered by. So if you're not wanting to bother somebody, make somebody upset, offend somebody, whatever term, then you want to be aware of the fact that if you're using that word, there's a good likelihood that somebody is going to be upset by that. So if you're trying not to upset anybody or you don't want to upset anybody, then you don't want to use that word. But sometimes you want to upset people. Sometimes it doesn't matter to you whether you upset people or not. And sometimes you're in a context in which you have every reason to believe that nobody's going to be upset and you can just use the word to communicate. My college had a program where upperclassmen could teach courses that underclassmen could take for about half the usual units, which was how I ended up taking a class on swearing in society. It's on my transcript forever. That is fascinating. And I actually do think swearing is a very fascinating, both in like how it currently works, like the idea that we have very commonly known, the very concept of curse words is a bit paradoxical, right? Because the idea is that these are words that are taboo, they're forbidden, they're bad words that no one should use. But in order for something to be identified as a curse word, it has to be a word that everybody knows so that we can all know and agree that it is the curse word, right? And of course, in reality, there are words that some people will think of as a curse word and some people won't think of as a curse word. But for the most part, we have a pretty solid list of like everyone more or less agrees that these are swear words. And, the vast majority of words are not. So it's interesting there. It's interesting in how we use it. It's also interesting in the history to me, specifically English curses. So curses generally, swear words, curse words, generally, there's a lot. I shouldn't say generally. I should say as far as the ones that I know well, and what I know well are Western European languages, the Latinate languages. It was a pretty fun class. Always fun to create grammar diagrams of the F word. The F word in particular in English is a placeholder word that you can use for almost any purpose, including grammatically. In the way that like thing is a placeholder word for any noun, right? Can you hand me the thing? That guy's in the movie with the thing, like thing can mean, but you can't use it to replace like adjectives and adverbs, like it's a very thingy day or whatever. Where F word you can use that as a noun, adjective, verb, adverb, like not quite everything, but almost everything. Like not a conjunction. Anyway, a lot of curse words are religious in their origin. I can't say this, I haven't like looked this up or anything, but I believe that's why we call them curse words, because they're curses. Profane. Profane is not the right word. It's kind of like that buffalo sentence. Yeah, buffalo sentence is funny. It's buffalo, 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 buffalo is a sentence that has actual meaning in English. There's a scene from the show The Wire, I think early on, maybe first season, where the two characters, they're cops investigating like a crime scene, and all they say is the F word, just different versions of it for like 10 minutes. Maybe not 10 minutes. There's so many like words in common usage in English now that come from religious or origins that we like, they've morphed over the years and we just don't realize. Like goodbye, which now I'm doubting myself because again, this isn't something I've looked up, but I believe goodbye is an evolution from like God be with ye, you know, like God be with you until we meet again kind of thing. But even things like, what's some of the ones that we kind of consider outdated or funny now, of like Zunes is a shortening of God's wounds in reference to the wounds that Jesus received on the cross from like Western civilization. In French Canadian, tabarnak is, and it literally just means tabernacle, and that's a curse. Egads is a version of ye gods. Now I'm blanking on a bunch, but there's a lot that are like that. Anyway, and then a lot of the other curse words in English come from a particular time. English obviously is a language that evolved in England, even though it's spoken in different countries now. That's the linguistic origins. There was a particular time in the history of England where a Germanic people, the Saxons, had been in charge for a while, and that was like had spread, and now everybody was speaking like a Proto-Germanic language. And then the Romans came in and conquered, but it was so far from Rome that like it's not like a bunch of Romans moved in, just like the kind of governors and whatever were from Rome. And so the high class, you know, the ruling class, the elite spoke Latin, and everybody else spoke a version of Proto-German. So to this day, a lot of our curse words are just the German version, the low class version, the crass version, like the F word, the S word. You know, they have, oh yeah, adios means again, with God. You know, look at how many people, religious or not, in the United States use, you know, oh my God, or Jesus Christ as epithets, curse words, you know, exclamations. Totally, not totally, but I was going to say totally unrelated, but it's not. I that's one of the things that comes up in genre fiction. I know we were talking about this last week, that I always like as a world building tool is that if you're writing a story that is not set on Earth, then when people need to curse in their dialogue, you got to come up with stuff. And it's one thing to use, you know, like it's not an uncommon thing for people to use regular Earth curse words, but you can't use the ones that are culturally specific. So you can't have a character that's from a different planet go like Jesus Christ as an exclamation or whatever. Talked a little in the class about how culture tends to swing between either filthy words or sacrilegious words being more offensive. Yeah, words literally associated with like dirt and uncleanliness for sure. But words that are associated, like one way of thinking about swear words is just that's what low class people, you know, like we still have sayings that aren't like super common, but not terribly uncommon in our culture of like, you know, someone has a 4-letter word vocabulary or whatever, as though those words, because they're, you know, we're identifying that those words are something that a person who knows less or thinks less or is less intelligent would use. Same with crass, is about being like low class. Anyway, that's something I like in genre fiction, is it gives a nice way to be able to build the world, and it's a tool for writers or whomever to be able to like, sometimes like the Battlestar Galactica remake from, you know, 2005 or whatever. Sometimes it's just a way around censorship, that they wanted to have like a relatively gritty and realistic feeling sci-fi show involving a lot of like military personnel. So they'd be swearing all the time, but it was on basic cable, so they couldn't actually use the F word. So in that show, the characters say frack and fracking as the replacement for F words. The show Firefly would use a lot of Chinese cursing to get around censorship stuff. But sometimes it's used as a world building tool, where one of my favorite series of all time, book series, I started reading when I was 12, The Wheel of Time, where like their curse words are things like blood and ashes, or oh man, it's been a while since I've read the book. There's a lot of curse involving the term light, because that's what in that book they reference, or in that series, light and the shadow, as opposed to like good and evil and whatever. Also, like a light blinded fool, right? Would be our version of like a damn fool or a cursed fool. But it like curses, yeah, they give you a little insight into what culture finds to be very important. For curses, we were talking about word replacement. So yeah, a while back I decided, because some people will talk about how using crazy or insane can contribute to stigma or cause people to feel badly about themselves, that it can be considered to be ableist language, right? As with all this stuff, there's a difference between the way that a person using the word, what they mean by it, or how they intend it, or what they're using, or how they're intending to impact other people, versus how people interpret it and how they're impacted by it. That is the point of this kind of thing, right? Like, if you don't want, light blinded fool sounds too logical. If you don't want to offend somebody, if that's not what you're trying to do, then it is useful to know that, hey, if you say this word, sometimes people will be offended by that. Now, obviously, sometimes people have a strong reaction to that, where what they're saying is like, well, that's not how I mean it, and therefore other people should not be offended. And like we talked about at the beginning, I can even in theory get behind the idea of like, sure, that's not what you meant. It's not fair that people are interpreting you in that way and treating you as though that is what you meant when it isn't. And still, that's how people are interpreting it. And you can complain all you want. It's not going to change how other people interpret it. So a lot of that that would have been a good example when I was trying to find one. It's like, why can't I say whatever anymore? You know, like, I've always said this word, and now people are saying that that's a bad word and I shouldn't say it. We're just getting mad at culture for saying that we're bad for doing something that, like, I don't mean it like that, whatever. But the point is that if you don't mean it like that, and if you don't want to impact people that way, then learning that it does impact people that way is useful, if you can then go about making the changes in how you use it. If you try to just not do it because you think of it as a bad thing, that's really difficult to impossible, but you can replace it. So the word crazy is a word that I used to use frequently, like most people in our culture do, for many different reasons. And very, very rarely was it ever actually a reference to either sincerely or as an insult in a derogatory way. Very rarely was it ever in reference to the idea of a person actually being like mad or insane, you know. Very common usage would be like, oh, that happened? That's crazy. Just an exclamation of like, wow, that is something I would not have expected and I'm interested to learn about, or acknowledging is unique and interesting, or something like that, right? And so the point I'm trying to get at is, if you're trying to replace a word that you use for many different reasons, then ideally the easiest is to replace one word with one word. But in order to do that, you have to come up with another word that covers all of the use cases. So you need another word that covers every time you use crazy, which I couldn't do. Maybe somebody else has an idea. So for that instance where someone's telling a story like such and such happened, to be like, whoa, that's crazy. For that, I use wild now, generally. That's wild. Like, oh man, you should have been there this morning. It was wild. This is what happened, right? I try to say wild instead. Yeah. Then there's the using crazy as a derogatory term, even if it's not intended to be referenced to like a person being insane, like that's a crazy idea. Or like someone's like, let's have ice cream for breakfast. Like, don't be crazy, Hey, me too. In that case, I tend to use ridiculous. Ridiculous is a word that literally means like deserving of ridicule. So if what I'm saying is like that's an idea or that's a thing that I am attempting to ridicule, I can just say it's a thing deserving of ridicule. That's ridiculous. Why do we start talking about replacement words? Oh, because the F word is one that is, you have to come up with many, many different replacements if you use it a lot and you're trying not to use it. Now, usually because of the nature of how people learn curse words, you already have those other replacement words first and you opt into using the curse word instead, and you just got to go back. But especially like enough time passes, or sometimes you do, that's how you learn to describe it or whatever the first case. But if you wanted to try to eliminate it, you got to come up with a replacement for every use. I got to wrap up in 5 minutes, but let's go back to where we started because now we came up with a good example. See, it was all planned. They're like, yeah, there's a word. Let's try and think. I'm going to pick a word that isn't actually one, to my knowledge, that's being discussed as like this word is problematic in some way. Let's say plan. Let's say for some reason somebody, the conversation starts to get out there that like, hey, saying plan is a problem. It offends people or causes these issues or whatever. It's hard to find good replacements when you want to really express disdain or being upset, though. Yeah. Ridiculous doesn't have great weight to it. That is true. For me personally, that's not a case where I used crazy a lot prior. But if I did, I would probably replace it with something like disgusting. You can get fun with it, but as much as I love language and words and playing with them, I also understand enough about how this works that like, just because you're using a word the way that it's intended or you're using a real word or whatever, doesn't mean that it's how other people will interpret it. Because one of the words that just popped in my mind was execrous, which is like crappy, basically. But like, you can't use that word. Nobody would know what it means, and even they would think you're trying to sound like high and mighty, hoity-toity. Honestly, sometimes like with crazy too, I started trying to replace that word because it was pointed out to me that it might, reinforce a stigma or cause people to feel less welcomed or, like more ashamed. But in doing that, it also became clear to me that like it's more impactful to have more precise language, right? That if there's one word I'm using for 10 different reasons, it might be better to use 10 different words for those 10 different reasons to be more clear and precise and impactful. Anyway, let's say that I have now learned that you're not supposed to say plan anymore. I can say like, well, that's ridiculous. Like, I don't know. I don't mean anything bad by it. Blah, blah, blah. I can complain. Like, this is absurd. This is where things have gotten to the point where like, now I can't even say this thing. And I know that when I'm saying this hits more on tropes of like conservatively oriented people, like politically speaking, or older people, not liking PC language. But it honestly, it hits on the progressive side politically too, and younger people too, especially when you have put effort into developing certain language for the express purpose of like, no, this is the better way to say it. And then now that's not a good way to say it anymore. I can lament, like, this is nonsense that people are going to think that I'm a jerk for saying this. And and I might even agree, right? Like, if you're saying that to me, I might be like, I agree. It's ridiculous that people think that about that word or whatever. us thinking that it's ridiculous, us not liking it or thinking it's absurd or whatever, doesn't change the fact, though, again, assuming that this is true in this story we're telling, doesn't change that that's how people view it, though. You can think it's absurd that someone gets offended by it, but they still do. So you can complain about it all you want, but either you're going to use it and people will sometimes get offended and you got to deal with that. That's what's happening. You can wish it isn't, but it is. Or you can work on replacing the word, eliminating it from your vocabulary. You can wish you didn't have to do that, but and just because you think it's ridiculous, even if 95% of people agree with you, they're like, yeah, that's ridiculous. You shouldn't have to deal with that. That's not cool. It's absurd that anybody is suggesting it this way. If that's still what's happening, then that's still what's happening. And truthfully, like we all, a big part of what culture is us all going through these rituals that a lot of them don't make any sense and are absurd, but we're doing it anyway. And we don't even notice it because it's something we've always done or something that everybody does. It's just, let me say, take any interest that you have, literally, like any fandom you're a part of, or any religion that a person, attends church with, or any sports that you care about or whatever. And if you view that, like, look at that community through the lens of like, what if this was a brand new thing that nobody had ever heard of? Like, what if this was something that got put on the news as like, look at this cult? Would they be able to point at like things that we say and do that everybody would see and be like, yeah, that sounds pretty culty? And like, pretty much, yeah, right? Like, they all involve some weird specific language that outsiders are not very familiar with. If you're super, I know knitting is a hobby. It's one that I don't have and I don't know the language for. I am sure that there are names for different types of stitches and different types of yarn and different types of projects and whatever, that if you were to say it, I'd be like, no idea what that means. And so if somebody was like, look at this, I'd be like, oh my gosh, what are they even saying? Right? Yeah, calling a person crazy feels actually less effective than calling them like a fascist or a fearmonger, if that's more accurate. Yeah, I mean, that's a valid complaint about cursing too, right? As we were talking about, like the F word can be used to mean so many things. That means it's very, very prone to misinterpretation, where being something specific, saying something specific or precise makes it difficult for people to take a different meaning from it than what you're trying to get across. Anyway, put a button on that thing of like, if reality is not what we want it to be, that sucks, and we are entitled to be upset about it. We can all agree, even in those scenarios where everyone agrees, like that's ridiculous. You shouldn't have to deal with it, whatever. Thinking that, feeling that does not change what reality is. This is why we talk sometimes about the idea to beat. Like, what's the best idea on the table about what to do? And if we're like, well, that's flawed, there's a lot of problems, it might make this worse, it doesn't address that, whatever, then still, unless we come up with a better one, that's still the best one we've got. Sometimes the best idea is one that does not solve all the problems or has some cost that seems unacceptable or whatever. But how we feel about things, how we think about things can be important, can be valid, sometimes even can be accurate without changing what is happening, what is real, and what options we have. I don't know what to do for like sociopath. I don't want to use a term that's like a diagnosable condition. We don't have time today, but another time we can talk about that, not only that term, but that concept, the concept of the sociopath. It is, I will say it is, I want to say controversial, but controversial isn't necessarily the right, or rather associated with one. It is a label that gets applied to people. It is often a term that people think of as being a specific reference to antisocial personality disorder, and therefore oftentimes is used as a specific reference to antisocial personality disorder. But the concept of a sociopath, I'll say that there is debate about it, especially because of the way that concept, this isn't about the language, it's about the concept. especially because of the way that that concept can get used in like legal processes. That if someone is deemed to be a sociopath in certain places and in certain like criminal proceedings and stuff, that can end up with a person who has like even fewer rights than they would otherwise. And just broadly, the idea that a person might not feel any empathy or whatever. We'll talk about it another time. I gotta get going. But yeah, I get that. Anyway, as a replacement term for what I think you're referring to, I'm making some guesses here, but inhuman could be a replacement term when you're trying to refer to like what this person is doing is like unconscionable, right? Like they're doing something as though they have no care or concern for what other people experience. Inhuman, evil, vile. Oh yeah, that sounds like it could go really bad, really fast. Yeah, I'll try to remember. There's a podcast I listened to years and years ago that was a really good one. I think it was an episode of This American Life with John. I want to say John Ralston, but that doesn't sound right to me. I'll see if I can figure it out. That was exploring it in the UK in particular, and does a case study on a guy who was being charged for crimes and pled insanity, or whatever the UK version of that defense is, and was like went through a process to get diagnosed or labeled as being a sociopath, and was routed to psychiatric institution rather than prison. And then like years later, when his prison term would have been up, he was still in that institution and couldn't leave, and was trying to get the label removed so that he could be released. And part of the issue is that like the people who were evaluating kept saying like, yeah, he appears perfectly normal, which is evidence that he's a sociopath, because a sociopath would know how to predict what other people are looking for and manipulate them by showing them what they're wanting and whatever. And even when he tried to say like, this isn't real, I made it up because I thought this defense would be better than going to prison. Well, that sounds very manipulative, like someone who understands how social expectations work and can put like that. Maybe, or inhumane. Yeah, inhumane. I don't really like implying it's divorce for the human condition. Well, that's, again, I'm making guesses about what use cases you're talking about. But that oftentimes when people are referring to someone as sociopathic, that's what we're saying with it. That's part of the reason that term is debated to some extent within the field, is because we are saying like this person does not experience regular human emotions or empathy or connection the way that the rest of us do. And it's just like a clinical version of saying inhuman or subhuman. And yes, these are all terms that, if applied or interpreted in certain specific ways, can be really big problems. But if what you're trying to say is that a person is behaving in a way as though they care nothing for other humans, that is not something that humans do. So if someone's behaving in that way, either you've got to come up with a concept that says they are different from other humans in this way, or a term where you're saying they're acting as though they are not human in this way. Anyway, I mean, there's other language you can use, obviously, but all of it would still be aimed at the same idea. I do got to go. It's good to be with you. Thank you, Bass Insider, for joining me in the comments there. And I will be back same time next week. Be well.